So when your React application starts to get a bit more complicated, you might want to start thinking about setting up different pages or routes to handle different parts of your application. So in this tutorial, we're going to take a look at the React Router and make a simple GitHub profile viewer app that will show you how to use React Router and separate different parts of an app into different routes. So let's take a look at the project and start coding. Okay, so let's have a quick overview of the project before we get started. So it's a very simple GitHub viewer. You may have made something similar before, but the main difference is we're going to have these tabs here, which are actually individual routes on the application using React Router. And as you can see at the moment, they're kind of disabled, but as soon as we actually go and search for a user, so this is a GitHub user. So let's actually search for a user, say the Octocat user, which is the standard test one. And you can see we go and get the data from GitHub, which is all fine, but we also enable the extra tabs as well. So we can click on those now, and as you can see, the URL, the route that we're actually browsing to, is updated. So now we can see the user's repositories, same for gists, and also for followers as well. So as I said a moment ago, the main purpose of the tutorial is to look at this routing and how you can use the React Router to achieve this. The actual data and things that you have in the tabs or whatever's on the page for this particular route is up to you, but this application just displays some of the GitHub information that we've retrieved. Okay, so that's a quick overview. Let's actually switch to the setup branch now. I've actually created a repository to get us started, and there's a couple of things in here which I want to show you. So this is using TypeScript, and you can, if you want to follow along, create your own React app, either with TypeScript or without TypeScript. But just so you're aware, there are a few things in this project. So in the package, for example, I've installed alongside React and the React DOM libraries. We've also got React Router DOM, which we'll be using to display different things depending on the route that's being selected. And also I've installed Axios to do our network requests, to send our requests to GitHub. But if you want to use Fetch or something similar, then feel free to do that as well. And the other cool thing, if you do clone the repositories, we've got this interfaces folder over here where we've got all of the interfaces that I've created for GitHub requests. So for example, if we're going to request a user, we'll actually get this type of data back. So it's all been typed for you. The same for repos, gists, and followers. So we'll be using these TypeScript interfaces throughout the tutorial just to make life a little bit easier when we're selecting properties from the data that's been retrieved via our network requests. Okay, so hopefully that's given you a little bit of an overview of the project. Let's actually get started writing some code now. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to focus on the routing for the first part of the tutorial just to get you up and running with React Router. And if that's enough for the tutorial, then you can leave it there. But then what we'll do is we'll flesh out the rest of the application and fill in the GitHub functionality to actually get the requests for that data from the GitHub API. So what we want to do is start to import a few things from the React Router library. So we're going to import the browser router, but it's more commonly known as a router. So we'll just alias that to as router there. And we're also going to import the switch component, the route component, link component, and also the redirect component. And they're all inside the library of React Router DOM. So we're not going to use all of these straight away, but what we will do is start to flesh out the routing for the application so we can start making a start and putting in those tabs. And if you're coming from a different framework or language, then this might seem a bit strange, but the router is actually a component. So in the same way that you would do with any other component, you can just actually create a new piece of JSX that actually has the router component listed inside it. And what we can do now inside this router component, we can put all of our links and routed paths inside of here, and the React Router DOM library will do the hard work of actually working out where all this should go. So I'm going to put a nav element inside of here, which is actually the tabs at the top of the page that you saw in the completed version. And inside there'll be an unordered list, and these are going to be all of the links to the various different parts of the application. So we'll have home, repositories, gists, and followers. So let's just create 4 of those for each of those particular tabs. And the first one, as I say, is going to be the link to get us back home to the search page. So I'm going to put in a link component in there. And this has one prop that we pass to it, and basically it's the URL, or the path rather, of where we actually want the user to be directed to. So in this case, the home would be the root URL, which is simply just wherever we are in the page with nothing else after it. So let's give that link a title of home, and then in the next one down here, we're going to have another link component, and this one will be to repositories. Let me just close this down for the moment so we can see that a bit better. And then the next one will be for gists. Oh, make sure we've got the / there. And then finally, we'll do one last one, and that will be the link to the followers. So if we save that now, you can see we've got the links to the different pages appearing. And if we actually click on those now, you can see that the URL does actually update. So we can go between home, repositories, gists, and followers. And so that's all you really need to do to actually get to the link to go to the correct URL in the browser. But of course, there's no content on each of those different URLs. So we need to make use of some of the other components that we imported a moment ago to actually get the content to display on those different routes. So we've created the link to the route, now we're actually going to create the routes themselves. So still inside of the router component that we imported, I'm just going to create a main tag just to let us know that this is the actual outside of the nav, this is the main section of our actual page. Okay, and now we actually use the switch component. And this is to switch between the different routes depending on what path is in the actual browser's address bar. So inside the switch component, we actually add some route components, and we pass in a prop to this to say what the path is that we want to register for this route. So for example, at the moment, I'm on the followers URL. So if we say the path is / followers, and then any content we want to display on that route, we put inside of this route component. So for example, let's say heading level 2 tag of followers. You can see that content's now appearing inside of that particular route. And if we navigate away to a different route, you can see it disappears, and going back to it, we get the content appearing in this route component displayed on the page. So that's how simple routing is in React, and we just need to fill out the rest of these route components to match the links that we've created in the navigation above. So for example, we can copy this and just change it to gists. And again, we'll do it for repositories. Again, making sure that we match the path that's in the link component above there. So repositories is the H2 tag there. And then for the final one, we're actually just matching the / path, which is fine, but we can actually just specify that we want to match that exact path as an additional prop to the route component so that it doesn't try and match any of these other routes below us. So let's just call that home. So back in the application, if we now click on the gists link, you can see we're getting the content from here, and repositories, home, and finally followers. So each of these link components that we've created here is now connected to the route component within this switch component. So that's pretty cool, and that's just a basic introduction to the React router. What we're going to do now is flesh out the GitHub viewer application and actually make that work, and then we'll look at a couple of other things that you can do with React router, such as implementing redirects and disabling those links depending on whether a user has been found. Okay, so to make a start on the actual application, within our app component, I'm just going to create a couple of bits of state. So the first thing is going to be a state called user search. And this is the string that the user actually types into the search box. So set user search, and I'll use the use state hook for that. And I'll just make sure that it's typed as a string, because that's the only thing the user can type in there. And we'll just initialize it as an empty string. And when we perform a search, what we actually want to do is keep track of the user that has been found. So we'll keep that in a bit of state called found user. So set found user is the setter there. And again, this is use state hook. But this time I'm going to actually use one of those interfaces that we mentioned at the start of the tutorial here. So the actual data that's going to be returned is everything that's contained within this GitHub user. So we'll have things like their bio string, their ID, their login, etc. So by using this interface, we can say that any data that's coming back from a request and set into this state here is of type GitHub user. So let's just import that here. Okay, so that's all the state that we need for this simple application. What I'll actually do now is just create a helper function just to do the actual search request when the user hits the button. So we'll say perform search request, and we'll be doing a network request, so we'll make this an async function. And inside there, we're going to try and get the response from the GitHub API. So we're going to say await an Axios GET request, and again we can type the data that is coming back from this GET request via Axios to be GitHub user. And then all we need to do is just specify the GitHub API URL. So it's https api.github.com. And the actual endpoint we're hitting is users. And then we need to specify the user name that the user has typed in. And that will be whatever they've typed into the user search state. We'll create the input box for that in just a moment. So we'll just say user search. So this will just create a string which will send a request off to the GitHub API. So assuming we don't get any errors from that request, what we can do is say set the state of set found user. Oops, I've got an uppercase S there. That will annoy me, so let's change that. Set found user, and on Axios the actual data is inside of a property called data, so let's just get response.data there. But if there is a problem, hopefully we won't run into any problems here, catch the error and just log it to the console. So that's our helper function to actually send a network request to the GitHub API with the current user that's set as the user search. Let's actually create a function to trigger that, which will be search for user, and we don't really need the event here, but it's basically going to be the form event submission. So going back to how React handles its script typings for events here, it might be just useful just to see how that gets actually populated there. But essentially it'll just be an arrow function where we prevent the form from being submitted, and also we then trigger a perform search request call. Okay, so this function will be called when the form is submitted, but obviously we don't have a form at the moment, so let's actually go and create that now. So in reality, what I would probably do for this is actually have a component which handles the display of all the contents within this particular route for the home route. But just to keep things simple and straightforward for this tutorial, I'm just going to put all of the content that will be on the home page directly into this route component here. So let's actually change it to search for a user, because that's the purpose of this particular route. And as I said, we're going to be creating that form here. And inside the form, let's give it a class name of search user. And we'll work on a styling just before we wrap up the tutorial. But the key thing is here, the onSubmit handler will link to that search for user function that we created just a moment ago. Right, so what do we need inside of our form? Well, we just need one input control. And the value of that will be bound to the user search state that we created. And of course, we need an onChange event as well. And essentially what we're going to do with the event that comes from that, it'll have the value that the user has typed. So we can, rather than creating a separate function, we can just say set the user search state equal to event.target.value. So if we save that, we should on the home page now have our text box, which has an initial state of an empty string. And if we type something in there, the value changes, and that will be what is stored in the user search state at that point. Okay, so let's add a button so that users can actually click and submit the form easily. So let's just say search. So now we can test that out. If we just open up our dev tools here, and let's put these at the bottom of the page here. So don't forget that when we submit the form, we call the search for user function, which essentially stops the form from being submitted and performs a search request. And all being well, it should use the user search state that we created to send the request to GitHub. So again, let's search for the Octocat user. Let's click search. And you can see there in the network requests that we've got a request to the GitHub API, and the URL has been set successfully to users Octocat. And the response contains exactly the same data, or at least same properties that we've got in the iGitHub user interface that we created. So things like avatar URL, bio, blog, etc. So the data we've got here matches the interface so that we know that the data that's inside of our found user state will actually have all of those properties. Okay, so again, in the home route, what we want to do is once we've had a successful search is to let the user know that we have a successful search, is to actually go and display some information about the found user on GitHub. So again, I'm just going to put this all in this one route. Ultimately, it should be in its own component, but this will do for now. So if we have a found user in our state, what we're going to do is we'll put a heading level 3 tag, and found user. And as soon as you try and access the properties, you can see that we've got the iGitHub user interface giving us all the information about the data in that found user state. So I'm going to display the login, which is essentially the username that the user has got in that h3 tag. And inside of another div, we're going to output a few properties. So let me just give this a class name so we can style it later on. So user details, and essentially we'll just have a div here that's got some paragraph tags. It's almost like a little bit of a table of the information about the user. Probably do something a bit more exciting with the CSS, but this will do for our tutorial. So from the found user object, we've got a name property, so let's show that. And we're going to show also the company, which is based on that property there. Got location, so found user dot location. Again, the IntelliSense helping us out with that. And finally, the followers is the found user dot followers, which I think is actually the number of followers that the user has. If we hover over the property, you can see that yes, it's a number value that's stored in that followers property. Okay, so if we save that, we'll need to do our search again. So let's just close down the dev tools for now. We know that's working. And there you go. You can see we've got our h3 tag there. We've got also the name, the company, location, and followers. And I think one thing we had in the original app as well was the avatar, the image of the user as well. So we can add that in here too, because in the found user object, we've actually got the avatar URL. There it is. So that's the full URL for the image, so that's really handy. So we just pop that into the source property of an image tag, and we'll set its alt property to be found user .name. Okay, so there's the Octocat avatar there. Okay, so that is the home route sorted. Let's move on to the repositories route. So what I'm actually going to do for the repositories section is do what I didn't do in the first route, which is to actually put this into a component. And there's a good reason for that, which I'll show you a little later on. So I'm going to create a new component called repositories list. I haven't created this just yet at the moment, but it'll take basically a repositories URL property URL, and that will be based on the found user .repos URL. Okay, so let's go ahead and create this component now. So it's repositories list.tsx, and let's just import React from React, and we'll have repositories list as a component, and just export that as its default from this module. And of course, we've got the props that are passed in, which is just the let's make sure I spell this right, repositories URL, which is a string. And then when the component initializes, let's just extract that from props. So repositories URL, that's a tricky one to spell, is equal to the props, and destructure that into this variable name here. And then what we'll do is we'll set up some state on this component, repositories list. Set repositories list is equal to use state, and we're going to be storing an array of iGitHub repos objects, which is what will be stored to this particular bit of state on the component. Okay, so we rushed through that a little bit, but maybe you can get an idea of what's going on here. So in the data that's initially returned from our first request when we're searching for a user, we don't get all the information about the GitHub repositories that they have, but what we do get is a URL which will tell us where to get that information. So I'm going to pass that URL from the initial search request into this repositories list component, which will then do the job of actually finding out all of those repositories by doing another network request, and then storing it in the component locally before actually rendering it. So we've got the state set up there. I'm actually going to use the use effect hook here. And let's just set up an async block inside here, because we're going to be using Axios to get the data. So the result here is going to be an Axios call, and the type of data that's going to come back is iGitHub repo, or at least an array of them. And all we need to do is pass in the repositories URL, which has been passed to this component as a prop. So this will basically send another network request to the GitHub API based off of the URL that's been provided. And then we're going to get an array of these iGitHub repositories, which if you see has all of these properties here, which will allow us to then display some information about the repositories that the user has. Okay, so all being well, if the data has been returned okay, we'll set the repositories list, which is the state on the local component. And again, it's stored in a property called data, so result.data is what we need there. And an important thing here, if you are following along as well, or using the GitHub API in general, if you don't authenticate, if you don't provide any authentication details, you're actually limited to about 100 requests every hour. So chances are you might go over that limit if you send lots of requests. And one way of doing that is if you the use effect hook will constantly run. So we need to put a dependency on there. So the repository's URL is a dependency, so unless that actually changes, this network request won't continually run, it'll only run once, which is what we wanted to do in our app. So let's actually render some content for our repositories now that we've got the data. So we'll have a div that's been returned from here. So it might be that we don't have any data for our repositories list. So if the length of that is not truthy, if it's 0 or undefined, then what we'll do is just output a little message saying no repositories found. But if that is okay, if there is a length property, if we do have results come back from our network request, what we can do is output an unordered list, which is basically the list items mapped to some JSX. So for each repository, you should see that it's actually been typed to be an iGitHub repo, which is useful. And we'll just actually output a list item tag, and we'll give it a key of repository.id. And we'll just put a link in here as well. So for each one, we've got repository.html URL is where the actual repository is based. And just to open it in a new window, target blank, and rel is no referrer. And then finally, we just want to actually show the repository name as part of the link. And that will just give us an unordered list of all of the repositories that have been retrieved from this second network request. Okay, so that's our repositories list component done. Let's go back to the app and fix the problems that we've got here. So the repository list, let's import that. And I've probably misspelled this, haven't I? Repositories URL. No, it's not complaining about the spelling, it's saying it's string or undefined, and that's because I've got a question mark here. I don't know how that snuck in, but in the type-safe navigator is just kicking in there. And that's what I was expecting to see. So we'll have a problem here because the object is possibly undefined on initialization. So when React tries to render this section here, found user state that's possibly been trying to be accessed here will likely to be null because the search request hasn't gone through yet. So we're just going to put in here a check to see if found user is actually truthy or not. And then we definitely know that the state of found user will be truthy and will have that repos URL property, and therefore the TypeScript error disappears. Okay, so the app is back up and running again, so let's search one more time for Octocat. And so now we've got the user details here, but if we go over to the repositories tab, you can see all of the repositories have been listed for the Octocat profile. Okay, so we need to do pretty much the same thing for gists and followers as well. So let's set this up here now for gists. So found user, and we're going to be creating a new component called gist lists. So let's go ahead and create that now. So I'm just going to run through these next few components because they're pretty much identical to what we just did with the repositories. So import React from React. So we'll have one prop on there called gists URL, which we'll pass in as a prop. Okay, so to get started, let's just destructure gists URL from our props. And we'll have some state on here, so gist lists, gists list, set gists list. And again, there is an interface for this as well. So it's iGitHub gist is the interface for it. Just make sure that's imported. Someone seemed to import that. Let's just do that manually. So I GitHub gist, and it's the directory is interfaces, and I GitHub gist. Okay, and then we set up our use effect hook again. Let's make sure that's imported as well. And one thing that was a bit funny about the gists URL, I'll show it you in the network requests in a moment, is that it does have some special characters that need removing. I think it's so that you can actually find specific gists by their ID perhaps. So we're just going to do a bit of regex to remove those. So if we find a curly brace and any content inside that, and then a closing curly brace, if we find any of those, just actually remove them. Okay, so once we've got a URL, we can do our Axios request, and same thing again. I GitHub gist, there'll be an array of those. Make sure we get our await keyword in there, and then just pass it that URL, which is the gist URL with the special characters removed. And once we've got our results, set gist lists result.data, and make sure we don't keep calling that request continually by just making the gist URL a dependency. Alright, okay, so let's actually return some JSX now from that. And again, it's the same thing as what we had in the repositories component. So for our gists list, if the length is not truthy, we want to say no gists found. But if not, what we actually want to do is display the content. So for our gists list, we're going to map through each one and we'll get a gist. Oops. And we'll use the gist ID, that's a property that's available to us, and another href, which is again, the gists have got a property called HTML URL, same as the repositories, and we'll do target is blank, rel equals no referrer, and the content inside there. And sometimes the gists don't have descriptions, so if we say use the gist.description property, but if that's null, if it's faulty, then we can just say there's no description. Okay, so that's the component setup. Let's just go back to the app and make sure that we're passing, make sure it's imported first of all. Visual Studio Code doesn't seem to want to import that for us. Let's just do it manually here. That's good. I think we're missing a property though. Yeah, it tells us in our errors over here, so let's make sure we pass that in. So the prop is gists URL, and that needs to be the found user.gists URL. Okay, and we've got an error over in the gist list component, and I think that's because we've got the same sort of problem that we had before, saying it might be undefined. So one thing we could do there is just initialize gists lists, the state there, as an empty array, and that should get rid of that error for us. Okay, so let's head on over to the gists component now, and we should do another request to find all of the octcat gists. And as you can see, some of them are coming up with no description, but the ones that do display OK. Okay, so let's have a look finally at the followers component and just flesh that one out. So in here, same sort of thing again. Found user, and we'll be creating a component followers list, and there'll be a followers URL that we need to pass in, which is on the found user followers URL. So let's go and create this component now. So followers list.tsx, import React, and followers lists will have props of followers URL, which is a string. Okay, and again we need to destructure followers URL from our props, and we'll have followers list and set followers list as our state. So we're going to use state, and again there's one final interface here for iGitHub follower, and that will be an array as well. Let's do what we did in the gists as well and just initialize that as an empty array. Use effect to send our network requests. And let's get another call to Axios just to get requests still, and iGitHub follower array is what is returned, and we can just directly use the followers URL. That should be fine. There's no data manipulation that we need to do with that this time. And when the data comes back, set followers list based on result data. Okay, let's not forget to put the dependency in for our use effect, otherwise we'll be rate limited on the API when we send 500 requests in one go. Okay, and then all we need to do now is just render some stuff back from here. And it's going to look pretty much identical to the other two as well. So, oops, followers list state, if there's no length in that, then no followers found. But if not, we have some results. So followers list.map follower. This time I'm going to actually render a div back for each of these here. Let's just get rid of those braces. Oops. And that div will, first of all, let's give it a key because it's got we've got a repeating item here. So we've got IDs on each follower, so we can use that as the key. The class name we'll just say is follower, and we're going to display their image. Source is follower.avatar URL. So same sort of thing that we did with the user data. We've got pretty much the same information. You can check out all the different properties on the iGitHub follower interface, but they're very similar to the iGitHub user. And we can also put in a link inside here as well. Follower.html URL and target _blank rel no referrer, and that will just have the content of follower login. Just close that so you can see that all in one go there. And I think we've got a bit of a mismatch here. I just need to close that map function off there. So that is the followers list. It's slightly different in terms of the markup for the other ones, but it's fairly similar in terms of what we're doing. Okay, so we just need to go back to the app.tsx and just make sure that we import that. The props all match up, so let's save that. Okay, so if we go to followers now, we should see a list of followers from the Octocat profile, and obviously the user's image and a link to their actual profile as well. Okay, so what I think I might do at this point is actually just copy and paste the CSS that I had in the original app into the working copy that we've got at the moment, because it's going to take a while to go through that, and yeah, it's fairly straightforward. It'll just give some styling to the nav elements and the button, etc. on the search page, just so you don't have to go through all of that. If you do want to check it out, it's in the GitHub repository. You can see now we've got our tabs appearing. But just to wrap up, what I wanted to show you is a couple more things React Router related. So the first is when we go to the home page to start off with, you can see that all of these links are still accessible, which isn't great because obviously we shouldn't be able to access these until we've done a search. So we can kind of restrict these links just by turning them off, or rather disabling them, depending on whether the user has performed a search or not. So there isn't really a good way to do that just with the links as we have them. So what you can do in this situation is have a little bit of an if statement here. So we've got found user. If we don't have a found user, what we'll do is just put in a span of repositories. But if we do have a found user, if that state has been set, then we can render the React router link. Let's just save that. So you can see there it's been grayed out and there's nothing to actually click there anymore. So we've just basically replaced the link component with just an empty span. And the CSS is picking that up and styling it appropriately. So let me just do the same thing for the gists and followers as well. So if there's not a found user, just render a span which says gists. But if there is, then we can render the link. And same thing for followers as well. Okay, so those are actually all disabled now until we actually do a search. Let's just see that's still working, Octocat. And now you can see that there, because we've got the found user set in the state, it's activated all of the other routes as well. That's one thing that you can do to disable routes or to dynamically change your routing menu. But what you might notice though is you can still go to certain URLs even though there's no data there. So if we go directly to /gists, even though that link's disabled, we can actually just go directly to the URL, and obviously it takes us to the component and renders it for us, but there's actually nothing there. So what we can do to stop that happening is if the user hits a route and we want them to be taken somewhere else to do some other action before they can access that route, potentially something like a login or something if the user hasn't logged in, then we can just redirect them back to the home page. So let's do that here. So we can do that by rendering a different component if the user has not been found. So for found user, if the found user state has been set, then obviously we can render the repositories list. But if not, we can render something else. And what we render is actually the redirect component which we imported at the start of the tutorial. And we just say redirect to, what path do we want to go to? Just /. So let's do that for gists as well. And also for followers. So now if we try and access the gists URL directly, it'll just redirect straight back to the search for user page, to the home page, because we don't have a found user set in our state. Okay, so that's pretty much it for this tutorial. Hopefully you've learned how to use some of the components that are available in the React Router library. We saw at the start how to actually create the links to different parts of our application and then actually connect those to the route components within this switch component. And we also looked at how you can disable the links by having a condition and also redirecting if the user doesn't have the required access or state necessary to display whatever is in that route. So thanks very much for watching. Just before you go, don't forget to subscribe to support the channel, and if you have any questions or comments, feel free to drop them in the comments below. And I'll see you next time.